Okay, let's circle back here, and I want to hear what you guys. I've never done this activity before, so what did you discover? Somebody was noting that the terminology is really different. Like they don't all use the same terminology to even describe the reference. But what did you find? Any observations?
So I was looking at MailChimp, and they have pretty much all the elements except they don't give you a schema. They give you the error responses, and they describe each very specifically.
Okay.
But they don't give you the non-error responses.
Hmm.
Yeah.
All right. Anybody else? Observations from? Yes, Bridget.
I don't think that folks tend to group the parameters the way you did in the Surfer report model that you checked out. So you had the path parameters and the query parameters
Yeah.
kind of sectioned out, and I don't tend to see that.
Did they just mix it all together, or did they just not have the other types? Like, yeah. In that surf report, I was specifically kind of trying to jam stuff in a couple different types for demo. I think it may be common that they don't really have a lot of different types. Maybe just have the query string parameters or something. But yeah. Anybody else? Observations from what you saw? The terminology is kind of all over the place, and how people organize things. I mean, sometimes they just say API reference, and that refers to all the endpoints or objects or methods or resources, whatever they decide to call these things that you submit to get responses.
A lot of missing response examples.
Yeah.
Like not just a lack of the schema, but the example.
Yeah.
Altogether.
When I was putting together this information on like how do you document a reference API topic, I was like, it's amazing how many docs don't do some of this or don't include some of this information. And it doesn't seem like rocket science to check all these boxes and to make sure that like each endpoint in some way has these things about it. It may be that you don't need an example for some type of API. I don't know. Maybe it's not a cookie cutter type model that fits, but I think it's a good approach to say this is some standard sections. Yeah.
On that note, I really liked eBay's documentation because they have all of the things with headers. Like every single page has an output, and then it includes the response headers, the response payloads, the response fields. And if there's nothing there, they say this call has no response.
Yeah.
So okay, there's nothing to see.
I think their documentation tends to be very thorough. Like their descriptions are longer than many others that I've seen in other doc sets. I think that must be in part because they've, one of the first players on the scene, and they're dealing with store data, financial information, and things that have real consequences if they don't document it, right? It's like, hey, half my store products are missing, or whatever it's doing. Okay.
Which API was that? eBay.
Something nice that MailChimp does, they have a getting started guide to the APIs. And they talk about a lot of the issues you raised, like, okay, we only take JSON, we show examples in curl, this is what the parameters look like and how they're formatted.
Yeah.
In general,
I don't know what they do at MailChimp, but they do docs right. I mean, have you seen their video tutorials? The what?
I'm a user.
Oh, you're a MailChimp user. Okay. Yeah, they're really like a model example in a lot of ways, except for the price of their newsletter. Sorry. Their newsletter service. If you have 4,500 people and you want to send newsletters every month, you're looking at $50 every month to a newsletter service, which is on par for these services. I'm just saying.
Yeah, I'm thrilled to pay only $50.
I just yeah. Anyway. Cool. All right. So I have one more activity in this section, and it's find an open source project. I'd say that a lot of people get interested in this area, API docs, because they're trying to build up their skills, they're trying to move into API documentation. But in order to transition from like an end user documentation position to developer documentation position, you need a few things. You need like writing samples and experience, and it's really hard to come by if you don't have a project. Now, I'm kind of guessing that the majority of you are taking this course because you have an API to document at your work, or you have some employer who's like, hey, ramp up on this because you're going to be doing this stuff. But if you don't, then the open source project could be really essential. And so, actually, let me just ask real quick. How many of you are documenting or taking this course because your company already has like API doc opportunities that you're trying to ramp up on? And how many of you are taking this course because you're trying to actually move in this direction entirely, like from scratch? Okay, so a few. All right, so we'll do this activity together. This is activity 3B. This is how you find an open source project. Now, I'll admit that I actually haven't done this myself entirely. The open source project I contributed most to was the Jekyll open source project and did a lot of docs there. But that wasn't necessarily an API doc project. This is really a challenge that people struggle with because they are hard to sometimes find, but this is how you do it. All right, step one, you're going to go to GitHub. This is where most everything is stored, or all the projects live. And they have an advanced search. If you just go to github.com/search/advanced, I just went directly there through the link. I'm not actually sure how you get there. And then step two, under the issues options, their site isn't so great at exposing this label, but under with the labels, type help wanted. This is a label that is somewhat standard. I guess I don't know how many GitHub people actually use it, but it will help. All right. And then number 3, you'll see at the top, once you do like a help wanted label, at the top it populates label. Then type something like documentation, API, and let's see, what else did I say? Yeah, those 2 words. And then do a search. And you'll see a lot of projects that, hey, we need some API documentation. So you can look at some of these. Let's look at, I don't know, any of these. And see what kind of needs they actually have. Summerfish Swagger. So this is actually some kind of project. It must be REST because they have the word Swagger in here. They've got the help wanted label. They've got the documentation label. This could be another label. And now we need to evaluate, like, what kind of project is this? Hercules. If I look at code, first I'm kind of curious to know if they've got a README link or something. And you can read more about it, I guess, at their link here. The mighty hero helping you build projects on top of IIT Carper's data. No idea, right? But you can look at this and see if this could potentially be, a hobby project for you to build some experience. And it looks like this actually has a few endpoints. I mean, there are actually API endpoints here. And this is the extent of their documentation for each endpoint. Which I did a search for this.
That's fine. I mean, what was the string?
Documentation API label : quote help wanted. I just kind of populated this, and I didn't find this ahead of time, by the way. I was just searching here. Help wanted in the labels. You can even use documentation as a label, but it populates up here, and then I chose the second one down, generate API docs, which takes me to some kind of Hercules project. And this is the task. I guess this is how they work on GitHub. You know, you're trying to find people to do something. You need some way to make it visible. Hey, I need help with this. Well, this is a standard tag, and this is the help the person wants. Now the question is, would this be a good project? So I went to their README page, and I have no idea what this on top of cargropers data would possibly be, but you've got actual endpoints, so we know it's a REST API project because we've got things that look very endpointy. This is all the documentation that he's got, right? For this first one, timetable code. Timetable of a course given the course code. Whoa. With this framework of what information we need, we could say, okay, this is our start of the description. This is okay, although we don't really know what kind of course this is. And we've got the sample endpoint. We don't know what methods it supports. Is this just a get method? We don't have any kind of idea of the response, although maybe clicking here. We've got a sample response already. And so we don't have a sample request, but we have the sample response. We could start to document it and go from there. So it's actually not a bad sort of project. I'm not really sure how great this would look on a resume. Like I helped, the IIT cargropers data project, but hey, if it lends itself to actual writing samples, that would look like this, or that would start with this information, but which could then be transformed. It might be a good starting point.
This wouldn't have any kind of a review process, or
No. Well, I'm sure the authors would want to review it. The other thing to check would be on commits. Like on the code tab, you see 110 commits. These are how many, how active the project is. It looks like somebody's going to town. Ayush 4 is committing all kinds of stuff. So it looks like an active project, but how big is it? Looks like at least just a couple of people or a few people. So yeah, anyway, this is how you could search for an open source project. Now, this is not something you knock out in a weekend, right? Like this would be something that would require weeks of involvement. And a lot of these might be projects, like let's look at this first one. They might be projects that aren't REST APIs because they could be like Java APIs. But here we see again a reference to a Swagger JSON file, so this kind of clues us in that it's probably about an API. Yeah, helping publishers to expose their services. There are all kinds of different things here. This one looks like they've actually got some documentation going on, some features. You can at least get some information about getting started. Looks like a Python something or other. Yeah, kind of interesting. Now, if you already work for a company, I would recommend working on some kind of project at your company because A, you can work on it at your company. B, it's probably more official, and C, it could transition, into more opportunities there. But I find tons of people are always asking me, how do I break into API documentation? Well, it starts with the writing samples and the experience. Without that, it doesn't really compute in terms of where you go. Any comments or questions about? Yeah, Dan.
So on the tool side, the deck side, okay, you got all these wonderful words there, but it's
sorry.
pretty poorly formatted. What are the options? I guess Swagger has some form of output of its own for the HTML and stuff, but I mean, you've got no navigation there. You've got none of the gee-whizzy things that people would be looking for.
We are going to dive deep into that. That's coming up in part 7, publishing API docs. We will jump into that. I think for some, as a writing sample, if you were to use just plain old GitHub to publish the content, if I were looking at that as a hiring manager, it wouldn't really bug me because, like, publishing tools, they're often done by people like you, right, who are like specializing in that, and the writers are they sort of just build on that. So it's hard. It depends what role the person is doing. If they're doing a hybrid role of writer publisher, then it becomes important. If they're not, then it's like, well, I'm interested in the content more than the presentation.
But suppose you're not being interviewed by
the
writing staff. You're being
then it would be
by the developing staff that says.
Then it becomes more of an issue. Yeah,
very nice.
there are some great tools that will take and read the OpenAPI spec and spit out a cool looking site. And then there are some ways that there's some different tool options. We'll get into that. As far as like integration into Ditto, you're going to find that like the tools that generate out the interactive API documentation will mostly just be linked to from other documentation. Unless you have the resources to do some kind of native integration where the two are merged. But again, we'll return to that a bit later in the publishing part. Any other questions about or comments about open source projects, getting experience? Okay, we have about 15 minutes to lunch, but we're going to move into the OpenAPI and Swagger realm. We keep seeing this jump up everywhere, right? So now we're going to finally dig into this, and it will be fun. We're going to keep it kind of at a high level because just out of practicality. Okay. So let me start off with a little story. I was once documenting an API, and the marketing team wanted to kind of demo this in front of field engineers. So what they did is they got out a PowerPoint slide deck, and they started to take screenshots of like code samples. Here's a sample request, here's a sample response, and they had other kind of marketing imagery in there that was kind of showing workflows and so forth. And the engineers on the phone listened to this. These are Japanese engineers, so very meticulous and detailed. And after the person kind of finished, after the marketing team finished this display, presenting the API entirely as a PowerPoint kind of presentation, they said they wanted to try it out. They're like, can you give us, sample code that we can try out because we want to see this for ourselves. And I started to think about this. This is really what engineers like. They like hands-on interactive experiences. They don't like static presentations. And I think it's probably safe to assume most people like hands-on stuff, but especially engineers. I once lived next to a guy who's an engineer. He took apart his entire car to change a head valve gasket, and he had parts all over his garage. And I was just like, yeah, you went into the right field in engineering. But they like this hands-on interactive experiences. This is how they learn. And this is part of why the interactivity is so key, is because with APIs, you want to see what is returned for your data. It might be nice to see a demo of something, but how does that work with my data, and what does that look like? It blends this learning model with kind of like a training component as well, when you can play around with it as you're learning. Okay, so the classic demo of this is Swagger Pet Store. If you just search for Swagger Pet Store, you'll land on this. This is Swagger UI, which is where we're starting in this Swagger discussion. But Swagger was the very first name of this approach, but it has now come to refer to tooling around the OpenAPI. At any rate, this is how this sort of interactive model works. You've got different things that you can expand and you can see and you can try it out. And I think our activity is to actually do it. Yeah. So we're gonna do 4A, explore Swagger UI through the Pet Store demo. So if you're following along here in 4A, you're going to go to the Swagger Pet Store. Now, most APIs require some form of authorization. So normally you would come to the Authorize modal here, click this and enter some API key, and click Authorize. Well, this is sort of just for demo only. Whoops, did I hit client ID? I think I can just type anything here, or you can just close it. It doesn't really do anything. It's just kind of like, this is how a Swagger UI display would work. Once you're authorized, now my API key is going to be included, with whatever I submit. So we're going to create a pet. Expand this first section here that says pets. You notice that, well, some people say this is a very dated display with the expand collapse, but others like to have everything on one page. So I don't know how you do that without having expand and collapse, but expand pet and then click try it out over here. When you click try it out, you'll see that this request body parameter becomes editable. And instead of doggy for the pet name, change it to some unique pet name that you'll be able to recognize. So I have a cat named Bentley, so I'll just change it to Bentley. And then for the, let's see, for the first ID tag, making sure. For the first ID, change this to some number, some whole number that doesn't start with 0 that you'll remember, like 991 or something, like something easy, but which other people won't also use in the same room, because you're going to retrieve your pet by that same number. So if you just make these simple changes and click execute, it's submitting a curl request, which you can see here. It uses backslashes to just escape things so that it can submit all of this through JSON. Actually, this brings us back to this point you were asking earlier. Why don't you just submit all this? Oh, no, never mind. Scratch that. This D parameter is referring to data, and it's escaping the JSON to make it safe during this curl request. Anyway, you can see in the response body that your pet is returned, and here it created my pet Bentley right here. And so I've actually got, this download button's new. Anyway, you've got the response. You've actually created this. You read about it, a pet object that needs to be added to the store. You saw what parameters were available. Actually, I forgot this model one. But if you click model, you can read like descriptions of each of these different tags. It's kind of wonky in there. They didn't really do a great job describing them. But anyway, were you able to get your pet created? Okay, so now remember your ID. If you forgot it, just scroll back up and see what you put in there for ID. And go down to get pet/pet ID, find pet by ID, and click try it out again. And this time we have not a request body parameter, but a path parameter. If you remember, this pet/pet ID, this parameter appears in the path, the endpoint path, and it's before any kind of question mark. So anyway, I'm going to put my pet ID 991 in here and click execute, and I see my Bentley pet returned here, my name of my pet. So that is pretty much how people use the Swagger UI display. The core of this information is all stored in this OpenAPI spec, which appears at the top. If I were to take this JSON file and just kind of load it separately, you would see all the spec information. The Swagger UI is a display framework that reads the spec in that JSON or YAML format and then pushes it into this display here. So you don't have to worry about publishing. this is all sort of taken care of, at least with the reference content. It's all taken care of by this framework called Swagger UI, which is why it's so popular. It's like, I don't have to worry about trying to figure out how to present all this, and I get a cool API Explorer built in where people can try it out. Sign me up.
So the top left, it says schemas, HTTP and HTTPS. Is that something that the developer code will say that we support both, or either?
Yeah. I'm not that familiar with that part of it, but let's see. Schemes is an object under. This is a root level object where you can define whether HTTPS is available or just HTTP. I think if you don't have this, it defaults to one or the other. But yeah, I don't know why that one looks unfamiliar to me. Maybe it's been a while. Now there's kind of something a little bit mind-blowing about this. If I go, let me pick out any. Okay, one sec. I can swap in another reference to a Swagger file, and it will just work. So here I have a Swagger demo in my course, and let's see. I think this is a standalone site. Okay, so this is a different file for the OpenWeatherMap API. But if I come back here to Swagger Pet Store and just paste in my YAML file and hit Explore, it totally loads it. So it's kind of, you could just use it and load all kinds of different files. And what displays depends on kind of what you've got in that YAML or JSON file. Anyway, this is, I think, let me come back to the pet store one. People tend to love the ability to try things out. And this is really the power of Swagger, at least the Swagger UI part. The other nice thing is that it's this whole standardization around API docs. Remember how when you're looking through each of these doc sites and it's like, oh, some people chose to do it this way and other people chose to do it that way, and here they didn't include this, but here they did. Well, now we've moved away from that and we've got a standard display, kind of like the Java docs, where things are predictable, things are defined, things are included, because if somebody doesn't include, for example, the method, well, then this just simply won't render. It will say error. So they have to sort of complete the blanks, the required parts, in order to make this work. And that standardization is why I'm an evangelist for this kind of stuff. So to provide some more clarity around how these two fit together, OpenAPI is the specification. Initially it was called Swagger, but in order to make it seem more vendor neutral, that it wasn't tied to a specific company, when the Linux Foundation adopted this spec and decided to embrace it and endorse it, they wanted to change its name to reflect a kind of vendor neutral open standard. So they called it the OpenAPI spec. And that is what most people think of or most people are actually referring to when they say Swagger. But essentially you have a structured description in the very specific schema that they define how the API should be described. And once you have a valid specification document, it can be read by a plethora of tools. One of these tools is called Swagger UI. So now anything that has the word Swagger in it refers to tooling that supports the OpenAPI specification. That's where I guess it just becomes confusing, because this Swagger UI is referring to the display framework that reads the OpenAPI specification. This is only one option. Swagger UI is one of many different options that can read it. And by the way, RAML is a similar specification to OpenAPI. It's probably better designed, who knows? But it has its own tools. There's one called RAML console that will process and do this. You can also convert programmatically like an OpenAPI spec to RAML and back. There's an API-matic transformer. So it's really not a big deal if you're working in RAML or something else. Now, I showed you this sample OpenAPI spec, and this is in JSON, but most people tend to write it in YAML, I think. At any rate, there are certain objects in there. OpenAPI, info, servers, paths, components, security, tags, and external docs. And I guess another one called schemes that I've forgotten or that's been added. You know what? I think, now I know why. The schemes refers to 2.0. This is another big thing. And why did they, yeah, okay, so here's another big headache. And I just apologize for this on behalf of the whole, I don't know, landscape. The OpenAPI has now moved on to 3.0, right? But like 90% of the tools only process the 2.0 version of the spec. So I'm going to teach you the 3.0 version because it's more future safe, and you can easily convert from 3.0 to 2.0 using automated tools.
Can you convert from 2.0 to 3.0?
Yeah. There's this nice little site, API-matic transformer, and in it you just plug in what you have and it spits out the spec in another format. But it's a huge, see, like convert now, for example, inputs can be anything, OpenAPI 2.0, so forth, to RAML and everything, and the outputs, whatever you want. It works. But a lot of the tooling, like for some reason, hasn't caught up to the 3.0 version of the spec. So you might see some things that are like, oh, we define this as Swagger. Well, in the 3.0, they define it as OpenAPI. And they change other things that have made it more efficient, like being able to reuse components and so forth. Anyway, it's kind of a headache. Eventually, the tools will be in harmony with the 3.0. But the 3.0 is what I would use, and then just convert it to 2.0 if your tools only support that. We only have like a minute to lunch. So before we dive into all this, let me just show this slide and then we'll stop. And hopefully, like, I thought I would smell food or something, but...
There is food there.
Oh, there is? Okay. The OpenAPI at a glance kind of looks like this. You have stuff defined in YAML, or if you want JSON, and you have to know like what the different objects are and what is allowed at each level in order to make this valid. But more than thinking of this as like a restriction, think of this as like a guide. Like, oh, now I need to specify the method, and now I need to describe it, and now I need to list the parameters. It's like helping you through all these little boxes to check. When we come back from lunch, we'll dive more into this and get some more hands-on experience and different tools and publishing methods. So, not really sure how lunch works, so maybe I'll go out and investigate, and then we can figure that out. But yeah, any questions before we break for this? I think we're gonna have, yep.
When are we back?
I'm guessing 1. I don't think it's hard set, so whatever. Sound good? All right. Let me